Hey everybody, this is week 2 of our series Atypical. We're talking about atypical families, not so normal families in the Bible, and our own not so normal families too during this not so normal time. Before we get going, I want to take a poll to learn a little bit more about what kind of families are represented watching this video. So comment below, how many siblings do you have? 1, 2, 3, I don't know. Comment below. Besides your parents and siblings, do you have any family members that live with you? Maybe a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or maybe a cousin. Comment below. Do you have any pets? Maybe a dog, cat, bird, fish, lizard, hamster. I don't know. We're in the South, so maybe a chicken, goats, or some cows. Comment below. When's the last time you had a disagreement with another family member? Was it today, yesterday, earlier this week? I can't wait to read y'all's comments. When you think about it, when it comes to our families, honestly, who gets to say what typical really is? I know if we're honest, a lot of times we let others' definitions or views of what's normal shape our own views and even the views of our family. Your family's already atypical, but what if God is calling your family to be even more atypical than it already is? See, every family has imperfections, problems, and struggles, but typical families either try to handle them on their own or never handle them at all. Atypical families, on the other hand, invite God into their imperfections, problems, and struggles. Last week we said that there is no family too complex or too simple for God to use. Your family can be used by God to do atypical, some not so typical things in the world. But how? At some point, every family experiences difficulty or conflict. You might be experiencing one of those right now. Typical families might try to handle those on their own or just ignore the problems and hope they go away. But atypical families, I believe, know that they can't handle them on their own. Atypical families ask God for help. Last week, we met the family of Adam and Eve, the world's first family. We saw their story and how it went very wrong as a result of their choices to disobey God and hurt each other. But because God is such a graceful God, He still used their family to do something amazing generations later, to one day bring Jesus into the world. So today I want to introduce you to another family. This family lived many generations after Adam and Eve, and they were atypical in their own way. You may have heard of Abraham before, and he's an important person in the history of faith because of an important promise that God made to him. And I'm going to butcher some of the names of these cities, but I want to learn about Abraham's life with you today, specifically his relationship with his nephew. It's Genesis 13, 1 through 13. It says this: Abraham left Egypt and traveled north into Negev, along with his wife and Lot and all that he owned. Abraham was very rich in livestock, silver, and gold. From Negev, they continued traveling by stages towards Bethel, and they pitched their tents between Bethel and Ai, where they had camped before. This is the same place where Abraham had built the altar, and there he worshipped the Lord again. Lot, who was traveling with Abram, had also become very wealthy with flocks of sheep and goats and herds of cattle, many tents. But the land could not support both Abraham and Lot, with all their flocks and herds living so close together. So disputes broke out between the herdsmen of Abraham and Lot. At that time, Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land. Finally, Abraham said to Lot, "Let's not allow this conflict to come between us or our herdsmen. After all, we are close relatives. The whole countryside is open to you. Take your choice of any section of the land you want, and we will separate. If you want the land to the left, then I'll take the land on the right. If you prefer the land on the right, then I'll go to the left." Lot took a long look at the fertile plains of the Jordan Valley in the direction of Zoar. The whole area was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, or the beautiful land of Egypt. This is before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Now that's an important point that we're going to look at in a minute. Lot chose for himself the whole Jordan Valley to the east of them. He went there with his flocks and servants and parted company with his uncle Abraham. So Abraham settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot moved his tents to a place near Sodom and settled among the cities of the plain. But the people of this area were extremely wicked and constantly sinned against the Lord. So Abraham and Lot were like many of our families today. They fought, right? In fact, they fought so much that if they had continued living near each other, they probably would have hated each other. So Abraham and Lot moved to completely different cities. Abraham and Lot had a long history of disagreements. But when Abraham learned God was going to destroy Sodom, the city where Lot lived, Abraham made a choice. He pleaded with God on Lot's behalf. And in response to Abraham's prayer, Lot and his family were saved. Last week we said that if you want God to use your family, right, you've got to do atypical things. And sometimes you have to be the first person in your family to do something atypical. That's what Abraham did. When you're fighting with someone in your family, it isn't typical to do what Abraham did. The typical response would be to fight back or to hold a grudge or to give the silent treatment. But Abraham chose to do the atypical thing. He prayed to the Lord for Lot in the middle of their conflict. He didn't wait on an apology. He reached out first through prayer. We see this in Genesis 18 and 19, where Abraham prays for God to save the city that Lot lives in. After spending some time talking to God, God about it, we see that God listened to Abraham's prayer. Genesis 19:27 through 29 says this. It says, Abraham got up early that morning and hurried out to the place where he had stood in the Lord's presence, where he had just prayed for him. He looked out across the plain towards Sodom and Gomorrah and watched as columns of smoke rose from the cities like smoke from a furnace. But God had listened to Abraham's request and kept Lot safe, removing him from the disaster that engulfed the cities on the plain. This may seem so simple, but it's so atypical. And here's what I want you to remember today. Not so typical families pray for each other. Just like Abraham saw that prayer could change his family for the better, I've seen prayer change my family for the better. And I believe prayer can change your family for the better. Prayer can change your families for the better too. Remember, families have imperfections and struggles, but atypical families invite God into situations through prayer. Listen, prayer doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as thanking God for your family, even if you're not sure you mean it in the moment. Maybe asking God to give you love and joy and peace and patience and goodness and gentleness and self-control, the fruit of the Spirit, right, as it pertains to your family. Asking God to give you wisdom to resolve your disagreement maybe with a family member, or asking God to do the same for the family member you're fighting with. Maybe you should just thank God for helping your family. Think about right now about a recent disagreement you had with a family member, or a disagreement you seem to have often. Now imagine how that conflict could be transformed if you stopped to pray instead of fight. How do you think prayer could change your attitude, your temper, or here's a big one, your perspective? How do you think prayer could change the person you're fighting with? How do you think prayer could change your family's pattern of behavior in the long term? It's interesting that Abraham chose to pray for Lot before they ever reconciled. In the middle of their conflict, Abraham went first by choosing to pray for Lot instead of continuing to fight. So this week, what if you decided to go first? When disagreements happen, typical families scream, fight, hold grudges, and struggle to find common ground. But not so typical families pray for each other instead. If you commit to praying for your family more than you fight with them, imagine how God might be able to use your family to do atypical things in the world. You guys have a great week.